What up to all out there, and hope your Monday is going excellent. Let's talk more alternate suspects. Specifically, why did the mayor of Moscow and his forensic investigators originally support the idea that the homicides occurred between 3 to 4 a.m.? And could it be this mysterious 911 call has been sealed from the defense and the public in general for over 2 years post-arrest because it contains verbiage and content in the recording that is factually damaging to the prosecution and instead favorable to Mr. Koberger, and further corroborate the idea and theory that these heinous crimes factually occurred prior to 4 a.m. This is part 1 of Does the 911 Call Support 3 to 4 a.m.? Let's get into it.
You said that it happened between 3 and 4 in the morning. Can you walk us through the timeline?
Yeah, the forensics indicate that the crime occurred at 3 or 4 in the morning.
Well, how did you arrive at 3 or 4 in the morning when no one was found until noon?
That was due to forensic.
Alright, so there's a lot to unpack here. So let's take this intel provided to Mayor Art Bethke by law enforcement investigators immediately following the homicides and combine that with what we know, and even more critically, and most intriguing of all to me, what we don't know at all forensically to date from 3 to 4 a.m. Was the perfect storm brewing? Was there trouble on the horizon for the Idaho 4 well before November 13th? Let's talk about some of the things we know in the hours leading up to the homicides that may give us reason to believe there factually was. Were there ongoing aggravating factors that seemingly set the wheels of fate in motion? Early on with Ethan and Xana, as seemingly confirmed by Xana's mom, was there an incident at a frat party, and what was it about? And in parallel, did Kaylee and Maddie's night out suddenly take a turn for the worse? What was the friction between them walking to the grub truck? And what was that, quote, everything that Maddie told Adam? And even at the grub truck, Kaylee was clearly preoccupied with her phone. Who was she talking to, and what was it about? Was the eye of the storm factually heading towards 1122 King? We know at 2 a.m., when Kaylee and Maddie returned to 1122 King, it is likely that Dylan, Bethany, Ethan, and Xana were already inside. Were there other friends that had been invited over? And was there some type of conflict that was going sideways quickly? Why did Ethan's mom, right after the homicides, state 2 a.m. was a dark hour? More specifically, what will Ethan and Xana's cell phone activity from 2 to 3 a.m. reveal? Were there any signs of distress or anything troubling in any texts or voicemails? What intel did Ethan's mom factually rely on to state 2 a.m. was a dark hour? So by 2 a.m., were the fate of the victims effectively already sealed? And did Kaylee and Maddie walk into some type of drama that was about to go next level? Shortly after returning home, Kaylee and Maddie initiate a series of rapid calls and texts to Jack D. So again, in parallel with Ethan and Xana, what will Kaylee and Maddie's cellular activity and content of any texts or voicemails reveal? Was 2 a.m. factually a dark hour for Kaylee and Maddie also? Were the texts and any voicemails to Jack D indicative of distress and or request for help of any kind? So again, as we pivot and move forward to trial, what will Dylan and Bethany be able to testify under oath as to what might have been going on inside 1122 King from 2 to 3 a.m.? Who else was there? And were they the source of any conflict or drama? Buckle up, this is where it gets very interesting. Leading up to this time frame of 3 to 4 a.m., based on all that we have discussed in this segment thus far, is there reason to believe there were facets of tension, discord, conflict, distress, etc. between the victims and other possible parties? Especially when one considers these 4 same individuals were factually slaughtered by edged weapon in their own home with no signs of forced entry just minutes later. But perhaps most perplexing of all, would you find it surprising to believe that 3 to 4 a.m., the same exact time frame that the MPD and their forensic investigators were so confident about immediately following the homicides, is the same exact time frame, 3 to 4 a.m., that we know absolutely zero about forensically over 2 years post-arrest? Think about that. So, in the interest of time, as we conclude part 1 of this series today, let's briefly examine the chapters of the timeline pursuant to the homicides and further analyze what we now know. First up, from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. was the perfect storm already brewing. Was this heinous act perpetrated a culmination of personal rifts manifested over time by jealousy, hatred, revenge, etc.? Next up, from 2 to 3 a.m. was the eye of the storm on a collision course with 1122 King, were tensions escalating between the victims and parties other than Mr. Kohberger. To me, Kelly was preoccupied with something prior to returning home. And also, again, Ethan's mom's comment about 2 a.m. was a dark hour leads me to believe there was some intel and something going on with Ethan and also likely Xana concurrently. Now, let's address and underscore the importance of this huge forensic gap from 3 to 4 a.m. This could be a massive win for one side at trial. We literally know nothing about what was going on with the victims during this hour, and even more critically, what will Dylan and Bethany testify to whilst on the stand under oath? As we know, there have long been reports that Bethany saw and heard things differently than Dylan and were actually favorable to Mr. Kohberger. Could it be this missing gap of time from 3 to 4 a.m. on November 13th that proves to be bombshell and could blow the lid off this case? Is this where the testimony from these two young ladies diverges? One thing is certain, this trial will be absolutely fascinating. Another piece of critical intel to keep our pulse on as we move forward to trial. Again, what do Xana and Ethan's phone records show for this critical span of time? If there is actually no cell intel for any of the victims after 3 a.m., does that seem to infer that this was the exact forensic evidence that Mayor of Moscow and law enforcement had relied on just after the murders as reason to believe sometime between 3 to 4 a.m. is when the victims were savagely attacked? Just to tie up a couple loose ends, in part 2, we'll talk in depth about 4 to 5 a.m. as well as the 911 call. And is there any potential intel that might be included in that recording that could tie back to time frames? So in closing, I have so many questions for you as usual. Based on the intel we have detailed thus far, is it logical to believe there are parties in the orbit of the victims, not Mr. Kohberger, that had motive and opportunity in the early morning hours of November 13th? What will the 67 electronic device analysis reveal at trial? Whose cellular data might indicate they could have been inside 1122 King during any of the times listed herein? As we know, the defense has consistently alleged alternate suspects exist in this case. In short, cell data and forensics will rule this trial. Last but not least, will Ann Taylor subpoena the mayor of Moscow and the law enforcement officials he was communicating with just after the homicides to testify as hostile witnesses in support of Mr. Kohberger, and call them up to the witness stand to explain to jurors why they initially selected 3 to 4 a.m. as the official timeline for the homicides, and also ask the forensic experts to detail the exact scientific evidence they relied on in support of this hypothesis. Is Brian guilty or innocent? Talk to me.